Before you say anything, I want to clarify, I'm actually trying to answer this question. I'm not here to tell you everyone criticizing these shows is acting in bad faith or are secretly just afraid of cringe or lack media literacy or whatever explanation people have settled on this week. Maybe it's ageism. Maybe everyone just hates young people and their funky words. I don't know, man. That kind of attitude is just not a valid way of acknowledging criticism. It's literally just avoiding it. If you respond to any, and I do mean any, criticism that way, I'm sorry, but you're just a bad critic. Sorry for being so blunt and specific, but you don't understand. You don't understand how many videos title, "Why is indie dialogue like that?" I've clicked on only for them to spend 20 minutes completely dismissing the criticism by blaming cringe culture or saying the criticism is somehow problematic or that that's just how millennials and Gen Z speak. But that doesn't answer the damn title! That doesn't answer the question, that's not... I can't even count how many videos dismissing backlash by saying, well, clearly you only think that because your insert personality flaw here I've sat through on the vague hope that they'd actually give any kind of insight. And I'm just tired. I'm so tired of pretending these people have a point. Because they don't. Or, well, that's not fair. It's not like they're flat out wrong. More so, they're making an argument that's structurally incapable of answering the question. Because those aren't rebuttals to the criticism. They're tangents. They shoot the question in the head before it can even be considered, which is unfortunate. Because I clicked to learn about dialogue. We're coming back to that later. Though, thankfully for my blood pressure, that's not actually the point of the video. Because really, why is indie dialogue like that? Here's a list of things I'll be discussing. I might have chapters on the video if I figure out how to do that, if you want to skip any spoilers, but regardless, be aware that every chapter does come with its own warning. Let's finally stop the preamble, this is getting way too long. Let's answer the damn question. Before I tell you what I think the issues actually are, I want to categorically reject the main reasoning I've heard to dismiss the indie dialogue criticism. No, millennials and Gen Z don't simply speak like that. I promise you. Ignoring that associating criticism to ageism or cringe culture as a way to dismiss it is, and I will not bend my knee on this, a fallacy. No one speaks like that. Not millennials, nor Gen Z, nor chronically online people, not even theater kids, especially not out loud. Conversation is messy in a way chat logs could never be. That's normal. If you try to get to the actual root of the issue, you're going to realize very quickly that the most commonly cited reasons for this trend of frankly plain out bad dialogue aren't actually as consistently true as people claim. The quips Marvel gets criticized for in some movies are the same thing that gets praised in others. Because the issue isn't any slang or curse words or tone. Those things are superficial. They're like blaming the bad taste of a meal on you not liking the presentation. Sure, that is potentially a factor, but there are several pieces of media with similar millennial or Gen Z humor that simply do not get this criticism. Undertale and Deltarune, Scott Pilgrim, Smiling Friends, BoJack Horseman. These shows should be, by all the measures people usually give, way too internet brain or too millennial Gen Z. They are practically radioactive with internet culture, slang, things that should rate as cringe, yet they aren't. I at least have never seen people throwing these criticisms at them. And while I'm sure it has happened, it's absolutely way less frequent than those indie shows. I think what sold it for me is that there's several pieces of media that are way too old for this to be the case, that have the exact same dialogue issues. It might be harder to see it now because of dialect shift, but they were criticized the exact same way in their time. So what's the issue here? If it's not slang or quips or brain rot? Well, there's a couple common pitfalls I've noticed, and every single show, movie, and book I can think of that gets its dialogue criticized this way suffers from them, to more or less degree, but I ultimately think every example people complain about boils down to the same thing. I'll start by listing the most common issues. Propose an example, then a piece of media that manages to avoid it while still technically doing the thing. Because it's not really these things themselves that ruin the dialogue, it's more so the way they're used. Now, something that I've mentioned in previous videos, and that a lot of people seem to link to bad writing, is therapy talk. And, well, yeah, if you find yourself doing therapy talk, especially between several pairs of characters, chances are your dialogue sucks ass. But it's not therapy talk itself that's the disease. It's a symptom. The same way filler and exposition aren't inherently bad. It's more so the fact that you're using them as a shortcut. You want your audience to understand, quickly and without a shadow of a doubt, what your characters feel and think. So you make them say it. Sometimes you might even add build-up, following the common advice of showing not telling, trying to force it to work, somehow, yet it still falls on its face the moment the characters actually talk. Why? Using hyper-articulate, clinical vocabulary, or even less clinical, hyper-self-aware monologues so characters can instantly infodump their entire psychological state to the audience will never be compelling. And I'm sorry, but that's just the truth. The next chapter goes on about this topic a little bit more, but the way to avoid this isn't making your characters never speak about themselves, and it's not taking away any and all self-awareness they might have. It's coming to terms with the people in your audience misunderstanding your story. If you're okay with that, or even better, capitalize on that, you could get BoJack Horseman. As the good example, BoJack Horseman is just the perfect counter-argument to the idea that it is therapy talk itself that's an issue. The show is packed full with therapy talk, point blank. Yet it's never contrived or obnoxious about it, because characters often use therapy language as a shield or a defense mechanism, as do most people who use therapy talk in real life, meaning that while they know the words, they still completely misunderstand how to fix their actual lives. They're often wrong about their issues, and even when they're right, therapy talk comes off more as a confirmation of the subtext that the audience has already picked up on by now. And nothing more. Rather than a fix all my issues button or a here's all that's wrong with me picture show, it's a purely theoretic self-investigation that often leads to more issues than it fixes. Characters misunderstand their situations or get to the wrong conclusions from the facts that they learn. They hear each other talk about things, yet still have no idea of how or even if they should help. It works because real people can be eloquent and they can be self-aware. They can know about their issues and speak of them cleanly, yet still not understand themselves. BoJack Horseman capitalizes on that to show that it isn't enough, that they're not better for it, that their shame is not helping anyone or redeeming them at all, and that, as paradoxical as it may sound, getting rid of all of that entirely might be for the best. A lot of indie shows do something that I can only describe as virtue signaling. And you can do that if it's the point of the character that they believe themselves to be better than they actually are. Audiences often expect that, so BoJack trusts that you will notice the gap between what people say about themselves and who they actually are. Your characters don't need to be idiots, please don't overcorrect, but they should barely, if ever, be 100% right. Speaking of which, this is a similar yet distinct enough issue to merit its own chapter. And I think it comes from a fear of those plots where everything could be solved with a single conversation. The issue is that when overcorrecting, the characters end up doing something that they can only do because they are characters. And thus, they have a writer. They have a god that moves them around and sets how they feel. A God that truly understands them, as well as they could possibly be understood. A God that can make the other characters understand them too. Now, I'm not gonna get into real-life religion right now, but unfortunately, if there's a God out here, it is definitely not interested in fixing our misunderstandings. If you have any type of communication or socialization issues, you'll probably understand what I mean immediately. But in case you haven't realized this yet, everyone in the world is convinced that they're both communicating what they mean perfectly and that the way they understand other people simply must be correct. It isn't, though. It never is. You can get very, very close to understanding someone else, but even in those rare moments where it feels like you're connected, you aren't. This is simply a truth about human communication. We can make dictionaries, encyclopedias, metaphors, speeches, but ultimately, what your mind shows you when I say the word fish will never be the exact same as mine. Characters aren't real people, though. They're extensions of a writer, no matter how well written they might be. If you fail to hide this fact, you get characters that don't have miscommunication, that know exactly what the other needs to hear, and are ultimately just a back and forth of the author talking to themselves. There's actually a lot of ways this one can present. They might avoid talking, they might even disagree in superficial ways. But the story doesn't let those disagreements change the direction of the narrative. Everyone seems to feel exactly what the current episode requires them to feel, and everyone is, ultimately, arguing variations of the same thesis. Just with fake glasses and a mustache. And that's closer to a podcast than a story. If you don't mind me making a bit of a reductive statement, characters should probably never understand situations the same way as each other. The cure for this could have been fixed with a conversation plots is to, well, have those conversations and have it not be enough. You can have a character understand themselves correctly, explain themselves as well as humanly possible, have everyone around them truly want to understand, yet have no one get exactly what they meant. I have a completely improbable theory, specifically and specially formed through the evolution of Superman films, funnily enough. I think cringe is way more complex of a concept than people give it credit for. And I think that whether irony or sincerity are considered cringe flip-flops like a pendulum. And I think a lot of current indie shows incorrectly assume that the pendulum is still on the sincerity side. You might have heard the terms post-irony, meta-irony, even maybe post-meta-irony. Meta-post-meta-irony? I don't think that one exists, actually. But I think superhero movies, more specifically Superman himself, and even more specifically his trunks, are the best ways to visualize this cycle. Just like, hear me out. There was a point in history where Superman was cool. Unironically cool. His trunks resembled strongmen, and his unflinching want to help people was kind of the whole point. Be it hope or be it naivety, people wanted to be him. Then the pendulum started moving. Suddenly he was cringe. You were cringe if you liked him. Irony was all the rage, and he was left behind by heroes that were gritty, complicated, morally gray, less sincere. About a year ago, something weird happened. Something that, as someone who has lived all his life on the irony side, surprised me. Superman memes changed. Suddenly, wanting to be Homelander was a reason to be mocked. Suddenly, people wanted to be Superman again. The social reward had shifted. James Gunn's Superman came out at the perfect time with the perfect message. I have my nitpicks with it as a movie, but it's the perfect show of commitment to sincerity, post-meta irony, more so. The rejection of the concept of irony as a shield itself. A highlight of how silly it is to get trapped by it. How stupid you look by shielding yourself with pretense and demanding to be seen as cool. How much insecurity hides behind it. Post-meta irony necessitates a level of commitment that other parts of the cycle don't. And it's the most interesting to me because of it. I'll say it directly. As we stand right now, irony is cringe. Or rather, the lack of commitment irony often allows is. The pendulum itself isn't really the important part. Writers always have to guess where audiences are at any given moment. The problem starts when they're so afraid of landing on the wrong side of the pendulum that they stop committing altogether. Undercutting every emotional, serious, or high-stakes moment with a self-aware joke or a meta-quip because the writer is terrified of looking cringe or melodramatic simply doesn't work. And neither does the post-ironic, "Look, I'm saying I'm cringe, so it's not cringe anymore." You can still use them, just not as a shield. It was done too much. It became mainstream. It became pretense, and thus uncool. Now it just makes you look scared. The last thing you want to come off of as a writer is scared. Undertale came out at a very strange time in the cycle, because the world hadn't fully let go of the 2000s irony poison era, yet it was prepared enough to accept the story's sincerity by itself. The fandom was still consistently called cringe though, even if people generally agreed about the quality of the game. Internet documentarians usually chalk that to being way too big for its own good. But looking at it today, isn't it strange that a fandom that's arguably as big as it's ever been is actually somewhat respected? Only weighed down by its previous reputation? Nobody's ashamed of liking Undertale anymore. I don't think it's a coincidence that people are suddenly comfortable making heartfelt love letters to Homestuck of all things. You used to get executed for that kind of thing. Eventually, you just get tired of apologizing for liking things. Positivity seems to be somehow an against all odds back in fashion. Audiences have moved on. Writers need to, too. I'll keep this one short, because I both have alluded to it and will allude to it again, but if your characters speak the exact same way, use the exact same sentence structure, vocabulary, cadence, and comedic timing, well, sorry to break it to you, but you're doing something wrong. Ideally, you should be able to tell characters apart by their dialogue alone, the way they decide to phrase things. But especially in audiovisual media, they should be able to say the same sentence yet be clearly distinct. In my critique of The Amazing Digital Circus, I pointed out that most of the lines could be said by basically anyone. If you're wondering if I changed my mind post-finale, well, no. You could delete every portrait and every name tag from a Deltarune conversation and you'd still have a pretty good shot at guessing who's talking. And that cast is like 100 times the size. They don't just have different vocabularies, mannerisms, and speaking quirks. They have different mentalities. If every character sounds like you, chances are you're not letting them disagree with you. Once again, we are just listening to a podcast. Big fucking Madoka spoilers! This one is same as everything I write, apparently. A direct dig at something I don't like about popular discussion of these topics. No! You can't fix every issue by just showing and not telling. You kinda have to tell things to your audience. I know I just spent most of this script telling you that you shouldn't be telling your audience everything. But that's the keyword. Everything. I keep seeing people swing from one extreme to the other. After hearing show don't tell 1,000 times, some writers become terrified of actually saying anything. They hide everything in subtext. But subtext isn't a suitable replacement for text. Whoever said subtext was for cowards left out a lot of nuance, but they weren't wrong. No shit, you need to show your audience how events actually affect the characters tangibly. And no shit, having rich and in-depth subtext is a good thing. But I see a lot of these shows forget that they have to actually write text to uphold it. They create a false sense of deepness by having subtext that's barely even there, often held up together by a couple of lines, vibes, hopes, and duct tape, and extremely explicit unrelated text simultaneously. They treat subtext like theory bait. But that's the issue. It's not connected. It falls apart under any scrutiny, and it's only obvious if you already wanted it to be true. Even people who don't bother to go that far can often feel like there's something missing. If you eventually decide to reveal your subtext, it might feel like it came out of nowhere, even if it technically didn't. Your text doesn't need to be a 10-meter long arrow with lights and sirens, but it should at the very least be an arrow. I'm not going to bother with a bad example here, because I think finding them for yourself is infinitely more valuable. But I am going to show you what to look for. One of, if not the most confident piece of media I've ever watched is Puella Magi Madoka Magica. And the funny thing is, going by the usual internet writing advice, it should not work. If you take every title I've had in this video at face value, this show would be dogshit. It constantly has characters explain themselves and what they feel. It actively and constantly discusses their motivations and the themes of the show. A good chunk of the dialogue could technically be said by anyone. And it's foreshadowing. Its foreshadowing isn't subtle. Soul gems, incubators, witch eggs, magical girls and magical women. That's cheap. That is writing 101. The show quite literally opens with one of the most basic forms of foreshadowing in media, showing you the ending. Except it doesn't. Every philosophical conversation in Madoka feels like it's only there because of the current situation, to make it more on the nose. Yet, then the show keeps going. Suddenly, the more you think about the characters' actions and the show's plot points through the lenses of those very on-the-nose conversations, the more you realize they didn't actually explain anything. They go on to reframe things that seemed so obvious and simple. If you let them, they make you update your understanding of the show so many times and so consistently that, well, there's a reason there's as many essays on the show as they are. Many contradicting each other on a surface level, yet still somehow being fully justified. The show is less interested on being an essay than it is on presenting questions and then presenting the consequences of characters choosing to answer said questions in one way or another. Even if there's basically no real foreshadowing, the line of causality this show creates is so incredibly strong, and its characters so consistent on their subtext that you're never actually surprised about the reveals. Flabbergasted, maybe. Most definitely, this show is batshit insane. But you rarely find yourself questioning things that the show doesn't want you to question. Going, oh shit, of course, is way more frequent than what? Because Madoka Magica doesn't actually hide things from you. It dangles them in front of your face and lets you gaslight yourself. Its writing operates as if there weren't any twists at all. It doesn't even imply that its opening scene is anything but the present. It doesn't have to. It happens in chronological order. It happens right before Madoka wakes up, as a literal event and not a premonition. Yet no one ever guesses that. I don't like calling this show a bait and switch, exactly because of how its subtext operates. Every conversation, every motivation, every facial expression, every pause, every framing choice, it tells you everything you need to know, and it trusts that you both won't see it now, but will see it eventually. It works like a domino line of setup and payoff, never lying to you, yet obscuring itself enough for your previous biases to override any logic. Now, why does that remind me of someone? I've recently started treating subtext the same way I treat foreshadowing. And while that might be a little reductive, it's a trick I think every writer could use to learn. If it never pays off, it wasn't really foreshadowing. If your subtext never actually collides with your text, how am I supposed to know it was intentional? Stop worrying about whether you're showing or telling. Worry about whether your story actually supports itself. Worry about showing the audience that there's more to dig, and then trust them to dig it. Worry about rewarding them for putting in the effort that task requires. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the jury, look at everything you've heard so far. What does every piece of information seem to come back to? Behind all the japping I can do and all the advice I can give, this is the biggest hurdle for amateurish creators. Insecurity. Amateur writers do not trust you, and they do not trust themselves. The worst part is that you can tell. More specifically, they don't trust their own skills to convey a point cleanly. So they sit you down and explain it. Literally, sometimes. A skill that's not often brought up in writing discussions is the skill to believe yourself to be skilled. And the truth is, I understand why. You don't want to believe yourself to be skilled if you aren't actually. And even if you are, no one wants to be that writer that believes themselves infallible. It feels egomaniac in a way. You want people to understand what you mean. It's the whole reason of writing. But the fundamental issue with refusing to believe in your own writing skills is that the less confident you appear, the less the audience will follow you. The more you keep explaining what your story means, the more people will tune out. The less people will understand, yet the more they'll think they understand. Funnily enough, as crazy of an example as this is, the thing that made me realize this was the Game Grumps playthrough of Danganronpa. Because Danganronpa does not trust you, or at the very least it doesn't in the evidence front. They repeat the same information 700 times. And you'd think that would lower the chance of someone misunderstanding or misremembering the evidence. But it doesn't. The Game Grumps complain about the games repeating the information over and over in a sort of we get it way, yet if you've watched any of those videos, you'll know that they didn't. Or rather, they constantly and consistently forgot the information they just said they got. This isn't a criticism of the Game Grumps, by the way. It's a writing issue with the Danganronpa series. The more you truthfully explain yourself to an audience, the more likely you are to be misconstrued. Because they'll assume that they don't need to think or remember information. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand why people have this fear. Believe me, I have seen enough stupid takes for a lifetime. I know that the literacy crisis is in fact a real thing. But you shouldn't be writing for the lowest common denominator. There will always, and I do mean always, be people misunderstanding your writing. That is just a fact of life. And if you shoot to make everyone understand, you'll either end up with a plain, boring story or with an audience where no one truly gets it. Regardless of how on paper obvious your point might be. I'm not kidding, make your audience work a bit for it. They'll understand everything better than if you don't. A confident writer doesn't spend the entire work trying to convince you that they're allowed to write. A lot of these indie shows feel like active explanations of themselves. And I truly don't know any other way to put it. I need to close this part actually, if nothing else for my own peace of mind. Dismissal isn't a valid way to respond to criticism. Except in the very specific yet common case that the person critiquing you misunderstood your point so much that they're basically discussing something else entirely. Audiences are great at noticing when there's something wrong with a piece of media, even though they're absolutely terrible at diagnosing what that something is. No matter how many mean-spirited pieces of criticism I've seen, either towards me or someone else, I have yet to find one that doesn't have some crumb of truth to it. You don't need to dignify everyone you see with a response, obviously. But if you're already committing to responding, this is just a big pet peeve of mine. Responding to criticism by attacking the person, assuming their values, or boxing them into the baseline assumption that they're wrong instead of actually acknowledging their point. The thing is that even if you're right, and they are a horrible person, guess what? Bad people can make good points. You always have the option to not engage, so I'd rather you avoided wasting everyone's time, including your own, by deciding to only pretend to engage. I know seeing criticism against things you like can hurt, especially if they're not said nicely. But the only way to improve as a writer is to act in good faith, even if the people around you aren't. Criticizing things you like is also simply a necessity to have good art. I know there's this strange idea that audiences have no rights on the work of a creator lately. And well, a creator doesn't have to do anything that you want them to do, but the idea that audiences don't have any say is just silly. There's a need for audiences to demand good art. Check out the history of ballet and theater if you don't believe me. Sorry for the tangent, if I see a single more video doing this kind of shit, I'm going to lose it. Well, that was kind of a bummer ending. Sadly, I have absolutely no idea if there's even anything else that I could possibly say about this. subscribe, I guess, if you want to be here the next time I get pissed off by some random online discussion and simply have to rant about it. Also, tell me if there's any other pitfalls or common issues with this kind of writing that you know of. As all previous times, my only hope is to improve my own writing. I'm not going to promise any videos anymore because I keep scrapping fucking scripts. Though, the Madoka Magica movie is coming out, and I have a bit of a thematic theory that I don't think I've heard anyone talk about. So, maybe that will be next. I don't know. Bye.